particular kind of cowardice that dresses itself up as wisdom, and it always sounds the same, no matter which species is speaking it. It sounds like careful phrases about practical realities. It sounds like gentle suggestions that resistance would be unwise. It sounds, above all, like a room full of powerful, comfortable people quietly deciding that someone else's home is an acceptable price for their own continued safety. The Galactic Council had been making that particular decision for centuries, and they had always found someone willing to pay it. Then, on a perfectly ordinary session day, they turned to the newest, smallest member species in the entire chamber and asked Earth to do exactly the same thing every prior sacrifice had done before it: quietly disappear so a larger, more dangerous neighbor could be kept happy a little while longer. They expected panic. They expected pleading. They expected, at absolute worst, a dignified, sorrowful acceptance of the inevitable. What they got instead was a single human ambassador standing up in front of 4,000 delegates and saying no, in a tone so calm it unsettled half the chamber more than shouting ever could have. Nobody in that room understood in that exact moment that they had just handed humanity the one thing every prior victim species had been too frightened to take for themselves. And by the time this story ends, you will understand precisely why the Council's most comfortable, well-worn tradition finally, permanently broke. The day it ran directly into a species that had simply, quietly decided it was done being anyone's acceptable sacrifice. The Great Council Chamber on Threvain Prime had stood for over 11,000 years, its vast domed ceiling engraved with the founding charters of every species that had ever joined the wider galactic community. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the oldest continuously functioning political institutions in known space, and it had, across those 11,000 years, developed a very particular institutional habit that none of its senior delegates liked to discuss openly. It had learned, across centuries of careful practice, exactly how to sacrifice someone quietly enough that nobody outside the room ever noticed it happening. Ambassador Naomi Achike had served as Earth's representative to the Council for just under 4 years when she finally understood, firsthand, exactly what that habit actually looked like in practice. She had joined the Council relatively recently by galactic standards. Humanity itself had only formally entered the wider galactic community a decade earlier, following first contact with the Varathi trade fleet that had stumbled across Earth's outer sensor network almost entirely by accident. In that decade, humanity had been treated, consistently and without exception, as the newest, smallest, least significant voice in a chamber that genuinely mattered. Achike had grown accustomed to that treatment. She had not, however, grown accustomed to what happened on the 412th regular session of the Council's current term. She arrived that morning expecting an entirely routine agenda: trade tariff adjustments, a minor border dispute between two species she'd barely heard of, a procedural vote on updating the Council's own translation protocols. Instead, she found her name already listed as the first item of formal business, and High Speaker Voranth Kell, an elderly, silver-scaled Dreeth who had presided over the chamber for longer than humanity had known the Council existed, was already waiting at the central podium when she took her seat. "Ambassador Achike," Kell began, without any preamble at all, "the Council has received formal correspondence from the Ashkar Dominion regarding territorial concerns along the galactic rim. We would like to discuss Earth's position in that correspondence directly with you, before the matter proceeds any further." Achike felt something cold settle quietly into her stomach. She had heard, in passing, distant rumors about the Ashkar Dominion, a sprawling, heavily militarized power occupying several hundred systems along the rim, known throughout the wider galaxy for a diplomatic style that consisted almost entirely of demands delivered with the thin veneer of formal courtesy. She had not, until this exact moment, understood that Earth featured anywhere in their concerns at all. "I was not aware Earth had any dealings whatsoever with the Ashkar Dominion," she said carefully. "You do not currently," Kel said. "The Dominion has expressed interest in expanding its territorial claims along the rim to include the Sol system and its surrounding sphere of influence. They have, in the interest of maintaining regional stability, offered the Council a formal proposal." A large holographic display activated above the central podium, and Achike watched, with a slowly dawning, disbelieving horror, as the proposal's AC. Tool terms scrolled across the chamber. Earth would formally cede all sovereign territorial claims to the Ashkar Dominion. Human military assets would be fully decommissioned. Human colonies throughout the Sol sphere would be reorganized under direct Dominion administration. In exchange, the Ashkar Dominion would agree to a decade-long moratorium on further territorial expansion into neighboring Council space. "You are asking me," Achike said slowly, once she trusted her voice not to shake, "to formally surrender my entire species' sovereignty, so that a hostile empire will agree to stop threatening everyone else in this chamber for exactly 10 years. We are asking you to consider the broader stability of this council," Kel said, his translated voice carrying a careful, practiced patience that Achike suspected he had used on precisely this occasion many times before, with many other delegates. "Earth is, by any objective measure, the newest and least established member of this body. Your military capability remains, by the Council's own assessment, considerably below the Dominion's current strength. A direct conflict between your species and the Ashkar would likely result in total conquest regardless of any assistance this Council could realistically provide. A negotiated transfer of sovereignty, by contrast, preserves human lives, human culture, and human continuity under new administration." "Under occupation," Achike said. "Under administration," Kel corrected gently. Achike looked slowly around the vast chamber. 4,000 delegates, representing 4,000 separate civilizations, and as far as she could tell in that moment, not a single one of them appeared remotely surprised by what was actually being proposed. She would learn in the days that followed exactly why that was, that this was not, in fact, the first time the Council had quietly arranged precisely this kind of transaction. 7 times across the preceding 2 centuries, by her own later count, a smaller, newer member species had been offered up, dressed in careful diplomatic language, to satisfy the appetite of some larger regional power, in exchange for a temporary peace that primarily benefited everyone else in the room. 7 times the sacrifice species had, eventually, quietly agreed. "I need to consult with my government," Achike said finally, her voice steady despite everything happening inside her. "Of course," Kel said, "the Council will reconvene this matter in 72 standard hours." Achike stood, gathered her materials with hands that she was, privately, extremely proud remained entirely steady, and walked out of the chamber without looking back at any of the 4,000 delegates who had just watched the proposal unfold without a single voice raised in objection. She transmitted the full recording back to Earth that same evening, along with a personal note to the Secretary General that read, in its entirety, "They want us to disappear quietly so everyone else can keep pretending the Dominion isn't a problem. I do not believe we should let them have that." The response came back within 6 hours, and it consisted of a single line that a Chike would carry with her for the remainder of her life. Tell them no, then tell them why. The Secretary General convened an emergency session of the full United Earth government within the day, and unlike the Council's own carefully measured proceedings, Earth's internal debate proved considerably less restrained. We cannot realistically fight the Ashkar Dominion, argued Defense Minister Priya Chandrasekhar during the opening session, her voice tight with a barely controlled mixture of fear and frustration. Our fleet, by every available assessment, is outmatched by a considerable margin. If we refuse this proposal and the Dominion decides to act unilaterally, we could be looking at genuine, catastrophic losses. We could also be looking at genuine, catastrophic losses if we accept it, countered General Marcus Webb, who had spent the preceding 6 hours reviewing every scrap of available intelligence on Ashkar administrative practices in previously absorbed territories. I've read what happens to species that get reorganized under Dominion administration. It isn't gentle, and it isn't temporary. Every single prior absorption on record eventually resulted in the conquered species losing its language, its culture, and in 3 documented cases, essentially its entire population within 2 generations. Then we're being asked to choose between quick extinction and slow extinction, Chandrasekhar said grimly. We're being asked, Webb said, to choose whether we go down fighting for something or hand ourselves over quietly so a room full of frightened diplomats can feel slightly safer for 10 years. He looked around the assembled table. I know which version of that story I'd rather have written about us. The debate continued for the better part of 2 days, and it was, by any measure, genuinely difficult, because unlike the fictional heroics of prior generations' war stories, this decision carried real, immediate, and potentially catastrophic weight. Nobody in that room was under any illusion that refusing the Council's proposal came without serious risk. But there was, running quietly beneath every argument in that room, a second consideration that eventually proved decisive, one that had nothing to do with military calculations at all. If we agree to this, said Ambassador Achike, addressing the full assembly via secure transmission from Threving Prime, we are not simply agreeing to lose our own sovereignty. We are agreeing to become the 8th species this council has quietly fed to a larger predator to buy everyone else a little more time. And somewhere down the line, when the Ashkar's appetite inevitably returns, this exact same council will find another small, new member species to offer up next, using the exact same careful language they used on us. She paused. I don't think the real question in front of us is only whether we can survive fighting the Ashkar Dominion. I think the real question is whether we're willing to let this council keep operating the way it's apparently been operating for 2 centuries, by simply being the first sacrifice willing to say no. She had spent part of the preceding 2 days pulling together what fragments of the historical record the Council's own archives would permit her to access, and she shared one particular case with the assembled government before the final vote was called. The Verith Enclave, absorbed into a neighboring power's territory some 60 years earlier under almost identical circumstances, no longer maintained a formal government of any kind. Their language survived only in a handful of academic archives maintained by scholars from other species. Their population, once numbering in the tens of millions, had been dispersed so thoroughly across their absorbers' territory that no single world anywhere in known space could still be reasonably called Verith soil. That is what preserving culture and continuity under new administration actually looked like, the last time this council arranged it. HFY told the assembly. I don't say that to frighten anyone into a decision. I say it because I think we deserve to make this choice with our eyes fully open, rather than trusting a diplomatic phrase to mean something gentler than what it's apparently meant every single time before. The final vote, when it came, was not unanimous. Nothing involving humanity's collective judgment ever entirely was, but it was decisive. 83% in favor of formal refusal. 72 hours after the original proposal, Ambassador HFY stood once again at the center of the Great Council chamber, facing High Speaker Kell and 4,000 watching delegates. Earth's government has reached its decision, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the vast chamber without any need for amplification. We decline the Ashkar Dominion's proposal. A ripple of visible surprise moved through the assembled delegates. Not shock, exactly, since a handful of species had technically declined similar arrangements before, but something closer to genuine, uncomfortable astonishment, since Earth was, by every objective measure the Council possessed, precisely the kind of member species that was supposed to quietly accept this particular fate. Ambassador, Kell said carefully, I would strongly encourage you to reconsider. The Council's assessment of the Ashkar Dominion's military capability relative to Earth's own defenses remains unchanged. A unilateral refusal, without any accompanying support from this body, places your entire species at considerable, potentially existential risk. I understand that risk, High Speaker, HFY said. I would like to formally ask this council a question, and I would genuinely appreciate an honest answer if one is available. She looked slowly around the chamber. How many times has this exact proposal been made before, not to Earth, to someone else sometime earlier? The chamber went very quiet. That information, Kell said after a long pause, is not directly relevant to the current proceedings. I believe it is entirely relevant, HFY said, because I've done some research of my own in the past 3 days, High Speaker, and I count 7 prior occasions across the last 2 centuries where this council quietly arranged for a smaller member species to be absorbed by a larger, more aggressive neighbor, specifically to preserve a temporary peace for everyone else in this chamber. 7 species. 2 of which, according to the Council's own historical archive, no longer exist in any recognizable form at all. Murmurs spread rapidly through the assembled delegates. Several representatives shifted visibly in their seats. Kell's composed expression, for the time since HFY had entered the chamber, showed something that looked distinctly like discomfort. Every one of those prior arrangements, HFY continued, was made using almost exactly the same language you used with me 3 days ago. Practical realities, broader stability, preserving culture and continuity under new administration. I imagine every single ambassador who sat where I'm currently standing heard some version of those exact same phrases, and I imagine every single one of them eventually agreed, because they were told, quite reasonably, that fighting back would only make things worse. She paused. I am telling this council, formally and for the record, that Earth will not be the 8th. Ambassador, Kell said, his voice carrying a note of genuine, careful warning now. This council cannot compel you to accept this proposal, but I must formally advise you that this body will not commit its own forces to any conflict that arises directly from your refusal. Earth would be facing the Ashkar Dominion entirely alone. We understand that, HFY said. We are not asking this council to fight for us, High Speaker. We are simply informing this council that we will not disappear quietly, and that whatever happens next, it will not happen in silence, the way it apparently has 7 times before. She looked out at the full assembly one final time. I would ask every delegate in this chamber to remember exactly what was proposed here today, and exactly how this council chose to respond to a member species refusing to be quietly erased. Because I suspect, someday, some of you may find yourselves standing exactly where I am standing right now. She stepped back from the podium without waiting for any formal response, and walked out of the chamber for the second time in a week, leaving 4,000 delegates behind her in a silence considerably heavier than the one that had greeted her original arrival. News of Earth's refusal reached the Ashkar Dominion's ruling court within days, carried, ironically, not by any human transmission at all, but by council delegates eager to distance themselves from a decision they privately worried might provoke exactly the kind of unilateral aggression the entire arrangement had been designed to prevent. Grand Marshal Osek Threll, Supreme Military Commander of the Ashkar Dominion, received the report with an expression his own senior staff had learned, across 3 decades of service, to treat with considerable caution. They refused, he said, more to himself than to the assembled officers in his command chamber. A species that joined the wider galactic community barely a decade ago, possessing a fleet our own analysts assess as roughly 1/5 our own military strength, formally declined a council-brokered transfer of sovereignty. The Council has already distanced itself from any obligation to assist them, Marshal, his intelligence chief offered. Earth stands entirely alone in this. Threll considered that for a long moment. In 30 years of expanding Dominion territory along the galactic rim, he had encountered exactly this kind of refusal only a handful of times, and in every single prior instance, it had proven to be precisely what his own analysts predicted. A brief, doomed gesture of defiance from a species that fundamentally misunderstood the mathematics of the situation they found themselves in. "Assemble the 7th Expansion Fleet," he said finally. "We will demonstrate to this newest species, and to every delegate currently sitting comfortably in that council chamber, exactly what happens to those who decline the Dominion's generosity." What Grand Marshal Threll did not know, and what his own intelligence division had not bothered to properly investigate, was that humanity's refusal had not, in fact, been a doomed gesture born of naive defiance. It had been, instead, the deliberate first move of a species that had spent the preceding 4 days doing considerably more than simply debating principles. General Marcus Webb had spent those same 4 days doing something the Council's own intelligence assessments had entirely failed to account for. He had been studying, in exhaustive detail, everything humanity's limited but growing intelligence network had managed to gather on Ashkar Dominion military doctrine. And more importantly, he had been quietly, urgently activating a defense framework that had existed, largely theoretical, in United Earth's classified contingency planning since the very week humanity had first joined the wider galactic community. "You built an invasion defense plan," Achike said, when Webb finally briefed her on the details via secure transmission from Earth, "before we'd even had our first hostile contact with anyone. We built a lot of contingency plans in that first decade," Webb said. "Most of them, frankly, I hoped we'd never actually need. This is the one I most sincerely hoped would stay theoretical." The plan itself, designated Operation Threshold, rested on a single core insight that humanity's own military analysts had identified early in their first decade of galactic contact. An insight that, remarkably, appeared to have entirely escaped the notice of every established galactic power humanity had since observed. Every major spacefaring civilization the Council recognized had developed its military doctrine across centuries, sometimes millennia, of relatively stable, predictable interstellar conflict. Conflicts governed by established conventions, formal declarations, and engagement protocols that had calcified over time into something closer to ritual than genuine tactical flexibility. Fleets fought fleets in open space, according to broadly recognized rules. Conquered populations, once formally defeated, were expected to submit. Humanity, by stark contrast, had spent its entire recorded history fighting wars that recognized no such conventions at all. The Ashkar are going to fight us the way they've fought everyone else, Webb explained to the assembled Defense Council. Overwhelming fleet strength, direct orbital engagement, followed by ground occupation once space superiority is established. It's worked for them every single time against every species they've encountered, because every species they've encountered has fought back using roughly the same playbook they're using to attack. He pulled up a tactical display. We are not going to use that playbook. Operation Threshold called for exactly what its name suggested. Not a conventional fleet engagement designed to win control of Earth's orbital space outright, which Webb's own analysts agreed was likely unwinnable against the Dominion's numerical advantage, but a defense in depth, designed to make every single stage of a Dominion invasion so costly, so unpredictable, and so fundamentally different from anything their doctrine had prepared them for, that the political cost of continuing would eventually exceed whatever the Dominion had originally hoped to gain. It relied, in considerable part, on technology and tactics that a decade of careful, quiet observation of galactic military doctrine had convinced Webb's team that no established power had ever seriously needed to develop, because no established power had ever faced an opponent willing to fight quite this unconventionally. Aboard the strike cruiser Meridian, one of the small, fast vessels quietly positioned along the outer system's hidden defense network, Lieutenant Commander Dara Okonkwo had spent the preceding decade training for a war she had genuinely hoped, right up until the final moment, she would never actually need to fight. She had joined the newly formed Sol Defense Corps at 22, recruited directly out of a naval academy that had, at the time, existed for barely 3 years, built almost entirely around doctrine nobody had ever tested in actual combat. "You think it's really going to happen?" Her tactical officer, a quiet, methodical man named Femi Bello, asked her as the Meridian settled into its assigned position along the outer minefield, powered down to the barest minimum signature required to remain functional. 10 years of drills, and I still half expected we'd never actually see this. "I think," Dara said, running her final systems check with hands that remained, to her own quiet relief, entirely steady, "that we've spent 10 years preparing for exactly this, and now we finally get to find out if all of it was worth it." She looked out at the dark, silent expanse of the outer system, hundreds of invisible platforms drifting patiently around her waiting. "I keep thinking about my grandmother. She used to say humanity never got good at anything by hoping it wouldn't come to that. We got good at things by preparing like it definitely would." Bello didn't have an easy response to that, and neither of them spoke again until the first sensor contact finally registered on their display, carrying with it the quiet, inevitable end of a decade spent hoping this exact moment would never actually arrive. The Ashkar 7th Expansion Fleet dropped out of transit at the edge of the Sol system 11 days after a Chike's refusal in the Council chamber. 180 warships, arranged in the standard Dominion conquest formation that had, across 3 decades, proven successful against every species Grand Marshal Threll had ever personally overseen the subjugation of. Threll himself commanded from the flagship Dominion's reach, watching his own tactical display with the calm, practiced confidence of a man who had done this exact thing many times before. "A sensor sweep of the inner system," he ordered. "Minimal military presence detected, Marshal," his tactical officer reported. "Standard orbital defense platforms around the third planet. No fleet-scale presence detected anywhere in the system." Threll allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as, "Expected, advance the fleet to standard engagement range. We will demonstrate the futility of resistance quickly, and this matter will be concluded within the week." The fleet advanced steadily inward, and for the first several hours, everything unfolded precisely as 3 decades of established Dominion conquest doctrine predicted it would. Then, at a distance still well short of Earth's own orbital defenses, the sensor readings on Threll's own tactical display began returning results that made absolutely no sense at all. "Marshal," his sensor officer reported, an unmistakable note of confusion entering his voice, "we're detecting gravitational anomalies throughout the outer system. Dozens of them. They don't correspond to any charted stellar bodies." "Debris field interference," Threll said, not looking up from his own console. "Continue advancing." 20 minutes later, the first of those anomalies resolved into something the Dominion sensors had genuinely never before catalogued. A small, unmanned drone platform, barely larger than a shuttle, that had been drifting silently in the outer system's asteroid belt for what the Dominion's own scanners eventually determined had been years. As the fleet's forward elements passed within range, the platform activated and released, in complete silence, a payload that Dominion sensors initially misidentified as harmless debris. It was not debris. It was a self-guided kinetic penetrator, accelerated to a considerable fraction of light speed across the preceding 2 decades of patient, gravitationally assisted drift, entirely passive, entirely undetectable by any conventional sensor sweep, until the precise moment it activated its own terminal guidance system. It struck the Dominion cruiser Ashkar's Glory amidships, at a velocity that rendered the ship's shields entirely, catastrophically irrelevant. The cruiser simply ceased to exist as a coherent structure. "What in the Dominion's name was that?" Threll demanded, staring at his own tactical display in genuine, dawning confusion. "Unknown, Marshal. No energy signature preceded the impact. No detectable launch platform. It's as though the weapon simply—" "Multiple additional contacts," another officer interrupted urgently. "The same signature, dozens of them scattered throughout the outer system." Threll felt, for the first time in 30 years of continuous military service, something he had genuinely not experienced since his earliest days as a junior officer: uncertainty. What Grand Marshal Threll was, in fact, encountering was the first layer of Operation Threshold, a scattered network of passive kinetic weapons platforms that humanity had spent nearly a decade quietly seeding throughout the outer Sol system. Patient devices requiring no active power signature, no detectable engine emissions, nothing at all for a hostile sensor sweep to reasonably identify until the exact moment they were needed. It was a defense built not around overwhelming firepower, but around patient, invisible preparation. Precisely the kind of long-term, quiet planning that a species with humanity's particular relationship to conflict had, across its entire recorded history, always proven disturbingly good at. Aboard the Meridian, Dara watched the first kinetic penetrators release confirmation flash across her own display. A single quiet line of text marking the end of 10 years of theoretical planning, and the beginning of something she understood, with total clarity, could never be taken back. Platform 7 confirms terminal guidance lock, Bello reported, his voice carefully level. Impact in 40 seconds. Dara didn't answer immediately. She watched the tactical projection instead, the slow, patient arc of a weapon that had been drifting silently through the dark for 2 decades, finally closing the last few kilometers of a journey it had been quietly making since before she'd even joined the Corps. 40 seconds, she repeated softly. My grandmother would have said that's about how long it takes most decisions to actually matter, once you've finally made them. The Ashkar glory disappeared from the tactical display a moment later, and Dara felt no triumph in watching it happen, only the particular, hollow steadiness of someone doing something necessary rather than something wanted. Confirm additional platforms holding position, she said. We don't move unless they force us to. They didn't move. For 6 more hours, the Meridian sat silent and dark at the edge of the minefield, watching from a careful distance as platform after platform quietly did exactly what it had been built to do, while Dara and her crew simply waited, invisible, for a fleet that had no idea they were there at all. The fleet lost 11 ships to the outer system's hidden minefield before Threll finally, furiously ordered a change in approach vector, routing his remaining fleet around the belt entirely rather than risk further losses navigat. Ing through it directly. It was, Webb would later note in his own after-action report, precisely the response Operation Threshold had been designed to provoke. The altered approach vector carried the Dominion fleet directly through a region of space that United Earth's defense planners had, with considerable foresight, quietly designated years earlier as an engagement zone, territory studded with additional hidden defense platforms, positioned specifically to punish any fleet attempting to avoid the outer minefield by taking the seemingly obvious alternate route. The resulting engagement lasted 6 hours, and by its conclusion, the Ashkar 7th Expansion Fleet had lost an additional 34 ships, without ever once bringing a single human-crewed vessel into direct combat range. Grand Marshal Threll, aboard his badly damaged flagship, finally ordered a full withdrawal to the system's edge to properly reassess. It represented the first tactical retreat of his entire 30-year military career. We have lost 45 ships, his executive officer reported grimly, without engaging a single enemy vessel directly. I am aware of the casualty figures, Threll said, his voice carrying a tightly controlled fury that his staff had learned, across years of service, to find considerably more alarming than open anger. Send word to the Dominion capital. I want the remainder of the home fleet mobilized, and I want every scrap of intelligence we possess on this species' military capability properly analyzed this time rather than dismissed. That intelligence, when it finally arrived from the Dominion's own analysts 3 days later, proved considerably more unsettling than anything Threll had previously been briefed on. Humanity, the report noted with evident, growing alarm, had spent its entire recorded history developing military doctrine around exactly the kind of asymmetric, unconventional conflict the Dominion's own forces had just encountered. Unlike every other species the Dominion had previously subjugated, humans possessed a documented cultural and historical pattern of continuing armed resistance long after conventional military defeat, using tactics that consistently prioritized patient, long-term preparation, and unconventional engagement over direct, symmetrical confrontation. More alarming still, the report noted that Earth's defense planners had apparently spent the entirety of humanity's first decade of galactic contact quietly studying Dominion military doctrine, specifically, alongside the doctrine of several other established regional powers, cataloging weaknesses and vulnerabilities that no established galactic civilization had ever previously needed to defend against. Because no established galactic civilization had ever fought a war against an opponent who approached warfare in quite this manner. The report included, almost as an afterthought buried deep in its appendices, a brief historical summary that Threll found himself returning to twice more before finally setting the document down entirely. Humanity's own recorded history included multiple documented instances of numerically and technologically inferior forces successfully resisting occupation for years, sometimes decades, through exactly the kind of patient, unconventional resistance his own fleet had just experienced firsthand. Conflicts fought not to achieve quick, decisive victory, but to make continued occupation costlier than any occupying power was ultimately willing to sustain. The report's authors, plainly unsettled by their own findings, noted that no other species in the Dominion's extensive historical archive had ever developed this particular approach to warfare as a matter of deliberate, generational cultural practice, rather than desperate improvisation in a single isolated conflict. They have been preparing for this exact scenario, Threll said slowly, reading through the report a second time, since the very week they joined the Council. It would appear so, Marshal. Threll set the report down and stared for a long moment at the star map showing Earth's system, now bristling with a defense network his own forces had already suffered considerably for underestimating. Then we adjust our own approach, he said finally. Full home fleet mobilization. We will not make the mistake of assuming this will be another routine conquest. Back on Earth, General Webb received confirmation of the Dominion's mobilization order, with an expression that carried considerably more grim satisfaction than concern. They're bringing everything, he told the assembled Defense Council. Full home fleet, estimated 300 additional warships on top of what remains of the 7th Expansion Fleet. That sounds like considerably worse news than good news, General, Chandrasekhar said carefully. It's exactly what we needed them to do, Webb said. Every additional ship they commit to this engagement is a ship there, not using to threaten anyone else along the rim. Every week this drags on is a week the rest of the Council gets to watch, in real time, exactly what happens when someone actually says no to the Dominion instead of quietly disappearing. He pulled up a new display. And every single one of those 300 additional warships is about to enter a system we've spent 10 years quietly preparing for exactly this scenario. The full engagement, when it finally came 3 weeks later, would eventually be studied across dozens of subsequent galactic military academies as one of the most thoroughly asymmetric conflicts in recorded interstellar history. The combined Ashkar fleet, now numbering close to 430 warships following the arrival of reinforcements, advanced into the Sol system with considerably more caution than the original 7th Expansion Fleet had shown, methodically sweeping for the kind of hidden defense platforms that had already cost them dearly. That caution, however, proved to be exactly the trap Operation Threshold's second phase had been specifically designed to exploit. Humanity's actual fleet, considerably smaller than the Dominion's own forces, exactly as every prior intelligence assessment had correctly indicated, did not attempt to meet the Dominion's advance head-on at all. Instead, it operated in small, highly coordinated strike groups, striking isolated formations, supply lines, and communication relays with a speed and unpredictability that Dominion doctrine, built around centuries of large-scale, symmetrical fleet engagements, simply had no established framework for countering. "They're not fighting a war," Threll finally admitted to his own staff, nearly 2 weeks into the engagement, watching his own casualty figures climb steadily toward levels that would have been considered catastrophic against any previous opponent. "They're fighting 1,000 small ones simultaneously and refusing to give us a single decisive engagement to actually win." It was, in fact, precisely what General Webb had intended from the very beginning. Humanity did not need to defeat the Ashkar Dominion's fleet outright. It needed only to make the cost of continuing the invasion so consistently, unpredictably high that the political calculation back on the Dominion's capital world eventually shifted against continuing at all. A strategy that relied, fundamentally, on a species willing to sustain genuine losses over a genuinely long campaign. Rather than seeking the kind of quick, decisive victory every established galactic power's doctrine was actually built around achieving. 6 weeks into the engagement, the Ashkar Dominion had lost just over 190 warships. Humanity had lost 31, along with, in a cost that General Webb privately considered far heavier than any ship, 308 human lives. It was during the 7th week that the engagement's true turning point finally arrived, and it came not from any battlefield development at all, but from the Galactic Council chamber, 12,000 light-years distant from the Sol system. Ambassador Achaik had spent the preceding 7 weeks doing something the Council had genuinely not anticipated when it had washed its hands of any obligation to assist Earth. She had continued attending every regular session, sitting quietly in her assigned seat, saying almost nothing during the formal proceedings. And then, during the informal gatherings that inevitably followed each session, speaking privately, patiently, and at considerable length with delegates from dozens of other member species. "I'm not asking you to fight for us," she told delegate after delegate, across 7 weeks of quiet, persistent conversation. "I'm asking you to consider what it means that this council has spent 2 centuries quietly arranging for smaller species to be handed over to protect everyone else's comfort, and that the very first time a species said no, this council's official response was to abandon them entirely rather than even consider whether the arrangement itself was the actual problem." It was a slow, patient campaign, considerably less dramatic than the ongoing military engagement unfolding in the Sol system. But by the 7th week, it had accumulated a genuine, growing coalition of delegates, many of them representing precisely the kind of smaller, newer member species that had always understood, on some quiet level, that they might someday be the Council's next convenient sacrifice. When the Council convened its next regular session, Delegate Soren Vash of the Threll Compact, representing one of the Council's more established and influential member species, rose to formally request an emergency review of the Council's ongoing non-intervention policy regarding the Sol system conflict. "This body has watched, for 7 weeks, as a member species defends itself against unprovoked aggression," Vash said, addressing the full assembled chamber. "We have watched it not as a matter of scholarly curiosity, but as a matter of formal council policy, having decided in advance that we would offer no assistance whatsoever to a species that simply declined to be quietly erased." She paused. "I would like this council to formally reconsider that policy, in light of everything the past 7 weeks have actually demonstrated. High Speaker Kell's expression, watching the chamber's mood shift in real time, carried an unmistakable note of genuine concern. Delegate Vash, this council's non-intervention policy regarding the original proposal remains. The original proposal, Vash interrupted, with a directness that council procedure rarely permitted, asked a member species to disappear so the rest of us could feel safer. That species said no. And in the 7 weeks since, that same species has inflicted greater cumulative losses on the Ashkar Dominion's military than this entire council has managed to inflict in the preceding 2 centuries of quiet negotiation and careful accommodation. She looked slowly around the chamber. I would like every delegate present to seriously consider what that actually says about the strategy this council has been pursuing all along. Not every delegate present shared Vash's newfound conviction. Delegate Korath Vess of the Ilmarin Consortium, whose own government had quietly brokered 2 of the 7 prior sacrificial arrangements over the preceding decades, rose to argue firmly against any change in council policy. This body exists to preserve stability across 4,000 civilizations, Vess said, his translated voice carrying the particular weariness of a man defending a position he suspected, even as he spoke it, was already losing ground. We cannot allow a single-member species' unlikely military success to overturn 2 centuries of carefully calibrated diplomatic practice. What happens the next time a species refuses and loses? What happens when this council's willingness to intervene emboldens conflicts we could have quietly avoided? What happens, Vash replied, is that this council finally has to reckon with the fact that quietly avoided has always meant someone else paying the price we weren't willing to pay ourselves. She turned to address the wider chamber directly. Delegate Vess asks what happens if a species refuses and loses. I would ask this body instead what has already happened 7 times when a species accepted and lost everything anyway, simply more quietly with this council's full cooperation. Vess had no immediate answer for that, and the chamber's mood, already shifting steadily throughout the preceding weeks, tilted further still. Ambassador Achaik, watching from her own seat, said nothing further during that particular exchange. She had learned, across 7 patient weeks of private conversation, exactly when her own voice would help the argument, and exactly when it would only give the opposition something convenient to push against instead. The resulting debate stretched across 3 additional sessions, considerably more contentious than any council proceeding in recent memory. But it concluded, ultimately, with a vote that would have been unthinkable 8 weeks earlier. A formal council resolution condemning the Ashkar Dominion's unprovoked aggression against a member species, accompanied by an economic embargo that immediately cut the Dominion off from critical trade relationships across a dozen separate systems. It was not, in itself, a decisive blow, but it arrived precisely at the moment Grand Marshal Threll's own political position back on the Dominion capital had already begun to visibly erode. As casualty reports and mounting costs steadily undermined support for a campaign that had originally been promised as a quick, routine demonstration of Dominion's strength. The final engagement came in the war's 9th week, when Threll, facing both a formal council embargo and mounting pressure from his own government to either achieve decisive victory or withdraw entirely, committed the entirety of his remaining fleet to a single, concentrated assault on Earth's inner orbital defenses. A calculated gamble that a single overwhelming strike might finally break the pattern of costly, indecisive skirmishing that had defined the entire campaign. It was, General Webb would later note, precisely the kind of decisive engagement Operation Threshold's final phase had been specifically designed to invite. "They're committing everything," Webb reported to the assembled Defense Council, watching the tactical display with an expression that carried more relief than alarm. "Every remaining warship. This is the engagement they've been avoiding for 9 weeks, and they're finally walking directly into it." The battle that followed lasted 11 hours, and it represented the first and only occasion during the entire conflict in which humanity's own fleet engaged the Dominion's forces in anything resembling a direct, symmetrical confrontation. It was also the moment at which Operation Threshold's final, most carefully guarded component finally activated. A network of orbital defense platforms, constructed in near-total secrecy over the preceding decade, positioned specifically to transform Earth's own inner system into a killing ground for exactly this kind of concentrated, desperate assault. Aboard the Meridian, now committed alongside the rest of the active fleet for the first time in 9 weeks of careful, patient skirmishing, Dara Okonkwo watched the full scale of the Dominion's final gamble resolve across her tactical display. Every remaining warship the Ashkar possessed, converging at once on a defense network that had spent a decade waiting quietly for exactly this moment. "This is the one," Bello said quietly beside her. "After everything, this is the one that actually decides it." "Then we make it count," Dara said, bringing the Meridian into formation alongside 3 sister ships. Moving into the gap, the platform network's opening barrage had already begun carving through the Dominion's forward line. She thought briefly of her grandmother's voice, of 10 years of drills conducted for an audience that had never existed until now, and then she stopped thinking about anything at all except the work directly in front of her. 11 hours later, when the last Dominion capital ship finally powered down its weapons, Dara sat alone in the Meridian's cramped cockpit for a long moment before she trusted herself to speak again, watching the wreckage of a fleet that had arrived 9 weeks earlier fully expecting an easy conquest, and found instead a decade of patient preparation waiting for them in the dark. Grand Marshal Threll, watching his own tactical display through the final hour of that engagement, felt something considerably more complicated than simple defeat settle over him as ship after ship went dark across his own formation. He thought, in that particular moment, of the very first briefing he'd received on this species, dismissive and thin, built on nothing more than assumption and 3 decades of unbroken success against opponents who had never once made him question the fundamental doctrine his entire career rested upon. He thought of every previous conquest, each one accepted quietly, each one reinforcing a certainty he now understood with total clarity, had never actually been tested against anything genuinely prepared to resist it. By the battle's conclusion, the Ashkar Dominion had lost 211 additional warships. Its home fleet, once the pride of a military power that had never previously suffered a meaningful strategic defeat in 3 decades of continuous expansion, no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. Grand Marshal Osek Threll transmitted his formal surrender from the heavily damaged flagship Dominion's reach 11 hours after the engagement began, becoming, in doing so, the first Dominion commander in the Empire's recorded history to formally concede defeat to an opposing military force. The war's aftermath unfolded across the following months with a complexity that General Webb, watching from Earth, found considerably more difficult to navigate than the military campaign itself had been. Grand Marshal Threll was recalled to the Dominion capital in disgrace. His 3-decade career effectively ended by a defeat that Dominion political analysts would spend years afterward attempting to properly understand. The broader political fallout within the Ashkar Dominion proved severe enough that, within 18 months, an internal political restructuring had replaced much of the Dominion's senior military leadership with a considerably more cautious, diplomatically inclined administration. One that formally opened negotiations with Earth barely 2 years after the conflict's conclusion, an outcome that would have been genuinely unthinkable to anyone observing the original invasion. Earth itself emerged from the conflict fundamentally changed, in ways that extended well beyond the immediate military outcome. The 308 lives lost during the campaign were formally memorialized in a ceremony attended by delegates from across the council, an occasion during which Ambassador Achike delivered remarks that would be quoted, in the years that followed, considerably more often than any of her formal council testimony. Dara Okonkwo attended that same ceremony. Standing quietly near the back of the assembled crowd in a dress uniform she still wasn't entirely used to wearing, watching 308 names scroll slowly across a memorial screen that had been erected specifically for the occasion. Bello stood beside her, and neither of them spoke for a long while, simply reading through names of people they'd trained alongside, people whose ships had gone dark somewhere in the dark quiet of T. He outer system, people who had spent a decade preparing for a war they'd genuinely hoped they'd never have to fight, exactly the way she had. My grandmother would have wanted to see this, Dara said finally quietly. Not the fighting part, this part, the part where it actually meant something afterward. We did not win this because we were the strongest species in the galaxy, Achike said, standing before an assembly considerably larger and more attentive than the one that had originally heard her refusal 8 months earlier. We won it because we refused to accept that the only available choices were quick surrender or certain destruction. There was a third option, and it was simply this: prepare patiently, refuse quietly, and be willing to pay a genuinely terrible cost for the right to remain who we are. She paused, looking out at the assembled delegates, many of whom represented species that had, within the preceding 8 months, begun quietly reconsidering their own relationship to the Council's oldest, most uncomfortable tradition. I would ask this body to remember these 308 names, not as a story about human military strength, but as a story about what it costs when a species finally decides it will not be anyone's convenient sacrifice. The Council itself, in the years that followed, never formally abolished the practice that had originally led to Earth's confrontation with the Ashkar Dominion. But it never again attempted to arrange it either, not because the underlying political pressures that had produced 7 prior sacrifices had disappeared, but because every delegate who had witnessed the Sol system conflict understood, with a clarity the Council's careful diplomatic language had never previously allowed, exactly what it actually looked like when a species said no and meant it. Ambassador Achike remained Earth's representative to the Council for another 15 years following the conflict's conclusion, and in that time, she quietly, patiently built the coalition of smaller, newer member species that had first coalesced during those 7 anxious weeks into something considerably more permanent. An informal but genuinely influential bloc within the Council that, more than once in the following decades, proved decisive in preventing exactly the kind of quiet sacrifice that had once nearly claimed Earth itself. She kept in her office on Threvin Prime a single-framed document throughout her entire remaining tenure, a copy of the Secretary General's original response to her very first transmission from the Council chamber. 8 words that had, in their own quiet way, changed the shape of an entire galaxy's oldest political habit. Tell them no, then tell them why. Years later, when a young delegate from a newly contacted species asked her, during one of the countless informal gatherings that had become a permanent feature of council proceedings, how she had found the courage to refuse the council's original proposal without any guarantee at all that Earth would actually survive the consequences. A Chike considered the question for a long moment before finally answering. "I'm not certain it was courage exactly," she said. "I think it was simply the recognition that some things are worse than losing, disappearing quietly and letting the next species that gets asked believe there was never any other option that would have been worse than losing." She looked out at the ancient chamber beyond her office window, the same chamber where she had once stood alone, facing 4,000 delegates who fully expected her to accept what 7 species before her had already accepted. "We didn't refuse because we were certain we'd win. We refused because we'd decided, as a species, that some prices simply weren't ours to pay, no matter how reasonably the request was phrased, and no matter how many people in the room were prepared to tell us it was the wise, practical thing to do." She smiled faintly at something that seemed to carry equal parts weariness and genuine pride. "It turns out," she said, "that's precisely the kind of decision that tends to end up mattering considerably more than anyone expects it to, at the exact moment you actually make it."